Gotthard Kettler was dead. Now comes one of the greatest tests to a leader's legacy, their heir, or in this instance, heirs. Gotthard's chosen heirs were his two sons Friedrich and Wilhelm. The obvious problem, though, was that Friedrich was 17 and Wilhelm was 13. As you can imagine, there were plenty of instructions for how the boys would inherit the duchy in the case that they were still minors, which they very much were. First of all, the administrative duties of the office would be split territorially into Courland under Wilhelm and Semigallia under Friedrich. Anna, Gotthard's widow, would have authority over the city of Jelgava, a very important city in the duchy. Gotthard's daughters, Anna and the one I forgot to mention last time, Elizabeth, weren't given much. They were both married off to different nobles and didn't have much say in the duchy's business. Since Wilhelm was still a preteen, Friedrich would run Courland as well as Semigallia until Wilhelm came of age. Friedrich was also assisted by the Duke's court and 10 counselors picked by Gotthard, since, although he wasn't as young as Wilhelm, he was still a teenager. All of that seems to have worked out pretty well. The only noteworthy thing to mention before Wilhelm takes charge of Courland were the regulations on celebration and dress. Regulations authored by Anna, which were meant for Jelgava but ended up being applied to the whole duchy. These regulations weren't necessarily unique, but they're still very interesting, so I want to have a look at them. There is a lot, but here are some highlights. Weddings could only take place on Mondays. Betrothal was permitted in a church, in the courtyard of a church, or in the home of honest people, in the presence of witnesses. No town dweller could wear a dress made of velvet or satin, and much, much more. Wilhelm was transferred authority over Courland in 1595. This didn't shake up anything, and the duchy continued to run smoothly. Wilhelm invested heavily in Courland's industries, especially shipbuilding and Ventspils, while Friedrich ran his side without doing anything especially noteworthy, until he married Elizabeth Magdalena. Like her husband's mother, Elizabeth was very involved in estate management and diplomacy as well. Not all would stay peaceful though, for there was tension between the great powers that surrounded the duchy. The reason why is a little complicated, so stick with me here. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania was an elected position. Although being related to a previous king wasn't a requirement, it definitely upped your chances. The former king and Grand Duke Sigismund II did not have any descendants. His sister, however, did. Catherine had married John III, the brother of the King of Sweden, Eric XIV. It wasn't the 14th Eric, but that's a story for another time. John eventually became king himself and had a son with Catherine, who was also named Sigismund. After the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Stephen Bathory, passed away, Sigismund was elected to take the throne, becoming Sigismund III. In 1592, Sigismund also became the King of Sweden after his father died. This unity could have created one of, if not the most powerful entity in Europe, but it didn't last, because of religion. Sigismund was raised as a devout Catholic by his mother, but the Swedish weren't big fans of the Pope, so they resisted. Eventually, Karl, John III's brother and Sigismund III's uncle, who was serving as Sigismund's regent while he was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, took the throne in 1599, becoming Karl IX. Not the ninth Karl, but at this point, not surprising. Most of the Polish and Lithuanian nobles didn't really care about Sigismund's claim to the Swedish throne, but Sigismund claimed Swedish Estonia, an action that most of the aforementioned nobles were cool with. Sigismund had literally no authority over Estonia, but after Sigismund tried to integrate Estonia in the Commonwealth, the Swedish decided to fight back. The war started in 1600. Friedrich and Wilhelm would be involved almost immediately, since the fighting was usually fairly close to Courland and Semigallia's border. Though both of them tried to get both sides to recognize the duchy's neutrality, the duchy's status as a vassal of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth pretty much forced them to fight on the Polish-Lithuanian side. In 1602, Anna passed away and Friedrich took over Jelgava. With the brothers' attempts at getting their neutrality recognized failing horribly, they both had to fight against the Swedish, sometimes even in person. The most famous instance of this is at the Battle of Kirchholm. The opposing forces met in the city of Kirchholm, a city on the other side of the river that made the duchy's border. Friedrich led 3 cavalry units across the river to join up with the mostly Lithuanian force that was still outnumbered by the Swedes, even after Friedrich joined. Despite that, the Lithuanians were victorious, causing the Swedes to retreat. Matthias von der Rieck, not the one from the last video, but his son, I think, one of his descendants for sure, almost captured Karl IX, but Karl made it out safely. Matthias got his helmet and sword though, which are some pretty awesome souvenirs. The war was far from over, but winning that battle allowed the duchy to have some breathing room for the next few years. In 1609, Wilhelm married Sophie, the daughter of the Prussian duke. This marriage was very strategic. Not only did it make the 2 duchies closer, but Courland gained a city that was leased to the Prussians during the Livonian War. Sadly, this marriage was to end in tragedy. Just over a year later, less than 4 weeks after her son was born, Sophie passed away. This tragedy greatly affected Wilhelm. Even if the marriage was strategic, from the letters that have been preserved, it would seem that they were pretty fond of each other. Wilhelm would never again marry. In 1611, Karl died, and his 17-year-old son took the throne. This boy's name was Gustav II Adolf, the Gustav Adolf, as in the man known as the father of modern warfare by some. Oh boy. The war took a toll on the duchy. Disease and starvation became commonplace. This probably caused a lot of stress for the brothers, especially Wilhelm, who had just lost his wife. And eventually, Wilhelm snapped. To explain why, I'll have to go back in time. After Gotthard's death, the Commonwealth found an opportunity to integrate the duchy into the Commonwealth proper. Courland and Semigallia had 2 different diets, and the Commonwealth was able to get most of the nobles in those diets to help them. In Courland, the conspiracy was especially treacherous, according to Wilhelm at least. In 1615, Wilhelm straight up disbanded the diet and started executing nobles he thought were committing treason. The nobles didn't take this sitting down, of course. They sent a delegate to Sigismund III asking him to do something about this, and he was more than happy to. A few decades prior, a law was passed that basically said that once the Kettler family had no more male heirs, then the Commonwealth would annex the duchy. One of the dukes had no children, and the one who did just did something that could justify deposing him. Sigismund set up a commission to investigate the situation. Wilhelm refused to submit to the investigation and refused to show up to trial. The commission recommended that Wilhelm be deposed and banished, and so in 1616, he was. In 1617, Friedrich was allowed to take control of the entire duchy. Friedrich was also pressured to accept another constitution, the Formula Regiminis. This constitution changed a lot, but basically it gave more power to the nobles at the expense of the duke. The war with Sweden also came back to the duchy's border, but this time, Gustav was able to capture Jelgawa in 1621. The next year, Jelgawa came back into Friedrich's hands, but was lost only 2 years later. Actually, a lot of the duchy's land was taken in 1625. But thankfully, after years of sending delegations to the opposing sides, Friedrich got a deal that would allow for both sides to recognize the duchy's neutrality. Gustav demanded that the Swedish army be allowed free movement throughout the duchy and free use of the duchy's ports. He also demanded that the Commonwealth's forces would not be allowed to use the duchy's fortifications or even set up camp within the duchy. This was very unfavorable for Friedrich. Friedrich allowed both armies to use certain roads freely, and allowed free trade with the Swedish and the duchy's ports, but no more than that. After a few years, Sigismund accepted these terms, and so Friedrich no longer had to fight in the war, but the duchy was still a bit of a battleground. It wasn't until 1629, when the Truce of Altmark was signed, that the war finally ended. The duchy's lack of direct action after 1625 allows us to talk about something else. You see, while Friedrich was fighting Gustav militarily, Friedrich was fighting Sigismund politically. Despite the fact that Wilhelm's banishment allowed Friedrich to take control of the entire duchy, Friedrich didn't want the duchy to be annexed as soon as he died. So he spent a lot of his time after Wilhelm got banished trying to get his brother and his nephew back into the line of succession. Friedrich was even able to call on allies from other European nations like Denmark, France, and especially England. The English and Scottish King James I supported Wilhelm a lot. In fact, James was Wilhelm's son's godfather. You may be wondering why the English king was so invested. Well, that's because Courland and Semigallia was very friendly to Baltic traders, including British ones, so they were a great source of revenue. But also, the duchy was Protestant. Technically, both states didn't practice the same sect of Protestantism, but their shared fuck the Pope attitude was enough for English kings to support the little duchy's continued existence. James sent a delegation to the Commonwealth in 1620, but Sigismund just referred to his commission's previous decision. In 1621, Gustav offered Wilhelm the entire Duchy of Livonia, as long as he accepted Swedish suzerainty. Wilhelm declined. England still wasn't done trying. In 1629, the King of England, now Charles I, sent Sir Thomas Roe, a man with quite the resume, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to help mediate a peace between the warring states. Sir Thomas Roe was also instructed with reinstating Wilhelm or his son into the Courland and Semigallia line of succession. This went as well as you'd expect. At this point, it was clear that Friedrich was not going to give up until his brother or his nephew's place in the line of succession was restored, and Sigismund was not going to let that happen. Both sides needed the other to die for their goals to be reached. After a few more years of trying, in 1632, Sigismund III died. Sigismund's son, Władysław IV, turned out to be much less invested into the annexation of the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia. Thomas Roe, with the assistance of French diplomats, successfully convinced Władysław and enough of the Commonwealth to accept Wilhelm's son as Friedrich's heir. They couldn't reinstate Wilhelm, but at the very least, the duchy would continue to exist. By 1640, Friedrich was old and tired. He had successfully kept the duchy out of Swedish hands by fighting back enough to get a favorable deal, and he had outlived the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, which finally allowed Friedrich to have a legal heir that would allow the duchy to continue its existence. Friedrich Kettler was 70 years old in 1640. He was around 17 when he first became the duke. He had held his position for an excruciating and turbulent 53 years, and he held it together despite everything that happened during his reign. Personally, I'm against the glorification of anything in history, but that doesn't stop me from respecting Friedrich a great deal. In 1642, at the age of 72, Friedrich passed away. In the next video, we'll be talking about this duchy's most famous and most ambitious duke, Jakob Kettler. See you then.